Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. Technology is all around us. It's especially all around PRI because we're just a short drive away from the heart of American innovation, Silicon Valley. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I caught up with Bartlett Cleland, PRI's Senior Fellow in Tech and Innovation. We cover everything from Tesla to taxes, from artificial intelligence to the artful strategies politicians use to lure innovative companies to their states. But we also touch on culture, the impact of technology on our daily lives. Should we celebrate tech, which brought us Amazon and Apple, or fear it due to the recent security breach at Equifax? Thanks for joining us in this freewheeling discussion with Bartlett Cleland. Welcome, Bartlett. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. So let's start off with the first question here. We often think of California as a nation's innovation leader, but as you wrote in a recent column for the East Bay Times, the Golden State isn't faring as well as it used to on innovation compared to other states. Why is this the case now?
Well, so I would rethink that just slightly and say you are right that California is not doing as well compared to other states as it has maybe in the last, 10, 15 years. That doesn't mean that it's not doing well. It still is number one in a variety of categories. However, as typical with innovation, standing still doesn't really cut it. And so as California doesn't continue to innovate, and in this case, we're thinking legislative, regulatory burdens, perhaps, taxation, et cetera, California starts falling behind by comparison to states that are more aggressive and trying to attract an innovation sector.
So, Bartlett, if you were advising the legislature, what policy changes would you encourage them to take to turn around this trend and help position California as a more attractive place for innovation companies?
So kind of embedded in the assumptions, I guess, of my previous answer, and that is to take a look at the whole picture. The whole picture is ultimately what matters for most business decisions and, frankly, these days for a lot of living situations. So people decide where they want to live. But specifically, reforming the tax code, California had, trying to remember, either the second to last or the last place ranking for tax burden within the state. There are typically any number of places in regulatory reform where help can be had. Sometimes simple things. How long does it take to review certain permits for certain technologies? I'm thinking here in the telecom space in particular, to be approved. Generally, create an environment where the freedom to fail, as I call it, that companies can take risks. Some call it permissionless innovation. Create that environment where that thought, where that ethic can prosper in the state. Avoid the mandates and the rules, often put in for reasons that aren't horrible. Put in for reasons that say we want business to succeed, but often put in as rules by people who don't know much about running businesses. Take those away. Let business compete in the market and let technology flourish. And then finally, one that people across the country, legislatures across the country fall victim to is often there is reference to specific technology embedded in legislation or in regulation. And that is almost always bad. It almost always stops growth in that area or innovation in that area, to be more exact. Avoid that kind of regulation or that law that embeds technology as opposed to goals and ideas of what should be accomplished.
Bartlett, in Sacramento, it's common for well-established companies to get a friendly legislator to throw up roadblocks targeting new disruptive companies that have become strong competitors. We've seen that in recent years with legislation targeting Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, and most recently, Blue Apron. What's your view on government tipping the scales to try and pick economic winners and losers?
So in the football season, this is an easy call to make. Throw the flag on this. This is not just a violation of free market and allowing the markets to operate. It's the worst kind of cronyism. It is using the power of government, typically because someone has lobbied someone enough who has power to get in the way of other competitors entering the marketplace. So government should instead be concerned with making only the rules that it absolutely must and allowing that marketplace to operate unfettered. I would add had today, and increasingly, at least as far as we can see, we're going to see that it's very easy for companies to move around, not just the country, but around the world. But even staying domestically, it's real easy for companies and then for employees, for that matter, to move to states that are really striving to be competitive and who aren't erecting barriers. So states that come to mind, Oregon, Nevada, Texas. I think that if you walk into the idea of good governance with that as kind of your frame, typically you won't go down these roads and follow the path of cronyism, but instead come up with some decent ideas and freedom to allow the market to operate.
Bartlett, one of the most controversial innovations in recent years has been autonomous vehicles, and it's something that we're grappling with at a policy level and in local communities across the state. Earlier this year, there was a lot of controversy over autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. Are they safe on the road? Are they causing accidents? I seem to recall there was even an issue with a moratorium on them being on the road for a little bit from the DMV. As with any kind of innovation like driverless cars, some are calling for more freedom as this new technology is developed and tested, while others are calling for stricter control. Looking to the future of autonomous vehicles, what do you think the future holds for California, and what do you think is the proper regulatory environment for driverless cars?
Well, I think your first question is kind of answered by your second question, and what's the future of California? That is to say, how should regulators be thinking about autonomous vehicles? I came across an interesting fact not too long ago, and I wish I could remember where. I tried to find it so I could share it with you. But it turns out that before the automobile was typical on a road. A street in a town more particularly, would be the place where folks gathered to talk. It's typically where they walk. It's certainly where kids played. And so streets, even though horses and carriages would come down the streets, or horses, I guess, but with riders, they were not thought of as a dangerous place to be. And one of the unforeseen issues with automobiles is it suddenly turned out that playing in the street, as our mothers all told us, was not exactly a smart thing to do, particularly if you're on a busy street. What's my point in all this? My point is that the regulators and legislators are getting way ahead of themselves in what to do with autonomous vehicles. Kind of goes to my discussion previously about permissionless innovation. We have a long way to go before we actually know how autonomous vehicles are going to operate and how they're going to operate within our culture. Are they going to be on some kind of restricted roads, for example? We've read this. Are they going to be on smart highways? We've read that. Are they actually going to be able to operate down the streets that we have today? That's where a lot of folks are trying to head now. None of that technology is perfect. None of it is settled. And honestly, the answer should not be from a legislative regulatory viewpoint to seek the perfect. Will there be accidents? Oh, I'm sure. Will there be other unforeseen problems? And by their nature, we don't see them, so we don't know what they'll be. But certainly, we need to let this technology, like we do with most technology innovation, develop, get to a place where we can actually see what is going on before we even start the discussion on now, goodness, how do we get a regulatory hand around its throat? In the meantime, let it grow, let it go. It's not really about protecting folks at this point. We do know that if you drive a regular automobile, you have accidents. People get injured, people die every year. Trains, same way. A couple well-documented train issues in the East Coast. I believe it was not Amtrak, it was others that were going up the Eastern Corridor. In fact, they had disengaged the automated device, and it was the train engineer in both cases that caused the accidents of their judgment. So we know there's some advantages already. We know there's some disadvantages, but we've got to let this innovation grow before we start seeking ways to restrict it.
Bartlett, one big issue this year involves zero-emission vehicles and electric cars. There's a real debate over whether government should provide subsidies to encourage Californians to buy these very expensive, clean vehicles. And I, for one, am a great fan of the Tesla. I'm in the market for a car, and the subsidies look really attractive to me right now. What are your thoughts on this? And should government be playing car salesman?
Well, everyone likes a handout, right? So sure, free money is always attractive, and I'm no different than everyone else, except that money's coming out of someone else's pocket. And that's the way we need to think about it, because that, in fact, is exactly what happens. When government picks winners or losers, particularly in the realm of credits or subsidies, all they're doing is shifting money from my tax bill into the pocket of someone that can afford at some level that Tesla. I think the Teslas, I've got to say, are really cool as well.
Yes.
I've had the opportunity to sit in one, and it only makes makes you kind of drool down one side of your face because you really want to drive home in that car right now. So I agree. On the other hand, we need to, again, let the market develop. Let the folks who are competing figure out ways to be competitive. It is interesting to me, and I think instructive. Folks often think of the automobile being invented by Henry Ford. In fact, it wasn't. Henry Ford figured out a way to make cars relatively, big quotes, affordable. The original cars were not so affordable. He figured out a way to do it. I suspect we will see something like that. We might be living in the middle of it right now. It might end up being Tesla that makes cars that a greater number of people can afford. And then over the decades, just like with the automobile, they will become increasingly, I think, popular and desirable, particularly as battery operation. People get more comfortable with the fact they can go further distances and be able to get to work and back home and whatnot and recharge and not have to worry about it.
Bartlett, a few years ago, states were literally in bidding wars trying to lure Tesla's infamous Gigafactory, which ultimately went to Nevada. And now it seems like we're going through this again with the proposed second Amazon.com headquarters. Is this a good thing? Should government be giving away the kitchen sink in incentives to attract these very desirable companies, or should the priority really be creating a good economic climate for all?
You're picking on all my favorite companies. My favorite days, I shouldn't say day of the week, but maybe it has become day of the week, is when the smiley face box shows up in my house. So I'm a huge fan of Amazon and have been, goodness, since the late 90s when they first started as a bookstore. So big fan. That said, exactly as I talked about just previously, and that is that government's not giving away anything of itself. It's giving away something from others. And so when we give subsidies or tax breaks to industry, not only is it cronyism, we are also just allowing our government to take our hard-earned money and pay it directly to a corporation. I know there are arguments that somehow betters the state, and it might very well be the case. If that is what the state is finding and they cannot attract competition or companies in the first place, then the right answer, what they should be thinking is, oh, we have a symptom of a tax code in this case, a tax code that somehow doesn't work. Let's take a look at reforming our tax code, probably dropping the overall tax burden so they can be more attractive to industry who will come in, hire people, and grow their local, state, or regional economy.
So that leads me, Bartlett, to the big news coming out of Washington now, which is the reduction in corporate tax rates. I think they're targeting about 20%. How is this going to help the tech industry? And frankly, here in California and other states, we also have high corporate tax rates. So I believe it's 4% in California. But that's really like a 24% tax rate for companies based in California. Tell us what you think about all this.
Well, so I think it's necessary, to say the least. So our last tax reform was 1986. That was an awesome year. That was the year I graduated high school. And as I sit here as a guy with girls who are about to go into high school, I think, good grief, that was a really long time ago. It is, if nothing else, one has to look at the tax code and wonder why we've kept it for 30 years. It is very much agrarian and manufacturing based. It's certainly not tilted towards innovation. And that assumes that you want a tilted tax code in the first place. Better would even just be to have a neutral tax code. But at the same time, forget what's happening internally. You look externally around the world. Tax rates around the world have been slashed, and particularly in the last decade, but certainly over the last 30 years. And I'm not talking about in places that might look across the room and say, well, good grief, do I really want to have to move my managers to that country? We're talking Europe, the heart of Europe. And of course, everyone picks up on Ireland and the UK, which are now in the low teens for taxes. It's hard to compete when you have a 35% tax rate, a 20-some% spread with those countries. One thing I'll note, we hear a lot of pushback that we don't quite need to lower the tax rate so far because the effective tax rate is something less than 35. And while true, you already raised one point, that emits from the calculus the state taxes, New York, another state with famously high corporate rates. And number two, also ignores the various adjustments that our competitors around the world might have to their taxes. So net, we're the highest tax jurisdiction in the world. I think it's fair to acknowledge we're a desirable place to locate your business. But at some point, just like maybe when you're choosing to buy a Tesla or another car, at some point, if the price point is low enough in the competition, you say, maybe it's worth checking out somebody else, if not moving there. And I think ultimately that's the balance we have to strike. We have to get to that point where people no longer, particularly domestic industries, look around the world to relocate headquarters, but instead say, we want to stay here. We want to grow the economy here. We want to grow the talent and attract the talent here and allow this region of the world, this country, to boom again.
Bartlett, one of the trends in the innovation economy is harnessing the power of artificial intelligence or computer systems simulating human behavior. You recently wrote the debut piece for PRI's new Right by the Bay blog on this subject, and our readers can take a look at that piece at pacificresearch.org. So in your view, what is the potential for artificial intelligence in California's future, and is this something to be encouraged, or is it something to be feared?
So I think the potential is huge. We go through various technological revolutions, just like there are industrial revolutions. They happen more quickly in technology, as everyone, I think, is probably tired of hearing how fast things move in technology. But it's true. And this is likely the next big expression of innovation. We talked about another one earlier, and it's automated vehicles. And frankly, these two issues are not that far apart intellectually. More functions and more tasks being automated. In some cases, higher functions being automated because there is artificial intelligence, or what we call artificial intelligence, certainly to be separated out from self-aware intelligence. We're not anywhere near that at this point. That said, I do think there are, I think you have to be honest and say there will be some interruption, some disintermediation of certain parts of industries. That's going to happen. On the other hand, so did the invention of the shovel as people stopped digging with their hands. You needed less people to dig with their hands if you have more shovels. On and on, up the ladder till you get to backhoes, et cetera, things we see at construction sites now. All of those things interrupted what was otherwise, I'm sure at the time, a very normal and happy working place. In the same way, artificial intelligence is a tool. And I believe what you will see over time is not just people who are building various artificial intelligence-laden tools, which will, of course, be growing the workforce. You will also find that people find new ways to use these enhanced tools to increase their efficiencies. And we know ultimately that efficiency is one of the big drivers of increasing a person's ability to make an income, and a higher income at that, standards of living go up. So I totally reject the dystopian future stuff. I'm much more positive. I don't think I'd be doing innovation policy if I wasn't more positive. It would be a little weird, I guess, if I were. But I think the future is going to be a wonderful place. And I think it's going to be laden with AI. And I think there will be a different looking workforce if we could come back in, I don't know how many years, 20, 40, 60 years. But I don't think it will be a sad and dark place filled with despair.
And another op-ed that you wrote for Investors Business Daily, you talk about the push by some on the left, including Silicon Valley's own Representative Ro Khanna, to use antitrust laws to target big and growing innovative companies. What's their motivation? In your view, do you think restrictive government policies will succeed in hurting innovation?
I'm tempted to answer this one by saying yes, but I'll go on. Absolutely they will. And I'm always a little hesitant to guess at people's motivations. I do find that congressmen who represent areas of the country they basically bank on innovation. They basically bank on figuring out the next steps and then inventing their way there, would think that antitrust is the right tool to use. Antitrust, at the end of the day, is a tool for big government. It is a means of government being able to point its finger, an accusing finger at a company, sometimes an entire industry, and to demand that they change the way government would like them to, or be broken up so that government can create their own set of businesses instead of whatever business was built by the desires of the investors and certainly shaped by the wants and the needs of the consumer and the citizens. If you're a big government person, I guess you would love antitrust. I was telling someone not long ago about my experience on Capitol Hill and how short-sighted we can be when it comes to innovation, particularly to antitrust. There was a famous set of hearings and lawsuit that happened around Microsoft back in the late 90s. And the whole question was whether, well, not the whole question, most of the whole question was whether Microsoft should in fact tie its browser into its operating system. And today, with cloud computing, you chuckle at that whole notion that is what we do today. In fact, Microsoft was just well ahead of the curve, but folks couldn't see it. And so what they did was slow down Microsoft. And there were certainly studies done then that showed that each American family lost value from their own pockets because of the actions that were being taken of slowing down Microsoft with these antitrust hearings. So I'm a huge skeptic on antitrust hearings. I'm a huge skeptic the government knows how to break industry into the right pieces. And frankly, I'm a huge skeptic that there needs to be such thing as, quote, competition policy, which is what America has increasingly tilted towards, away from the original antitrust notion, which was about doing what was best for the people. We now do things that are best for competition. So it's a little, to me, it's a little odd. It's certainly, it's a lot odd. It certainly breaks up innovation. Innovation's dynamic. And so when you set your foot in the middle of an innovative space, you really don't know what's going to happen. And when you use a cudgel as crude and as large and as government laden as antitrust, I think you're asking for nothing but a poor outcome.
Bartlett, the recent Equifax data breach affected nearly 1 out of 2 Americans, including me. Protecting our financial privacy is really an area of increasing concern for Americans, and I know it has been for me in reading all the literature since the data breach became public, trying to figure out what I should do and what I shouldn't do. Some are calling for more government action to prevent future breaches. In your view, are private companies doing enough? Should government step in and act to do more to protect our financial data?
A great question, and really a complicated area for a lot of reasons, and additional complications because you actually have had it happen. Typically, when I address this question, I'm not dealing or interacting with someone who's been emotionally impacted by it, which makes it a little more esoteric question. But it's interesting you bring it up. I was also affected. So it is one of these times in your life where you stare your principles in the face and decide, well, do I abide by my principles or do I do lash out as I like? So, but to the point, this is an old question that society has had to deal with multiple times. There's a quote that no one seems to really know exactly who said. I think it's often ascribed to Benjamin Franklin. I think I saw that was debunked. But basically, you're trying to balance security and privacy or citizens' rights versus government's ability to, quote, help, assuming it can help. And that's a tricky thing to get right. And I think it always will be. So I think we have to start with that premise. This is not an easy solution. And I think it defies, honestly, a lot of political philosophy to figure out. However, that said, there is a real challenge because what we have in this country is that about 80% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, including financial networks, including chemical plants and all kinds of places that all kinds of dangerous things could happen and harm individuals. So you do truly have a situation where private industry is involved in government. People are crying out for government to do something. Current considerations, debates, discussions have certainly included many voluntary standards of many sorts, but developed by the federal government. Those never were put into place. There was a discussion on making them law. That was rejected, I think, correctly, or because these are just a small step away from becoming mandatory requirements, which is to say more regulation. The right answer is something closer to encouraging the private sector to engage in good behavior, clean practices for cybersecurity, so long as everyone understands that there, again, as we talked about with automated vehicles, there is no perfect solution. There's no perfect solution to keeping robbers from breaking in your front door, regardless of how much security you have. We might be able to catch them afterwards, but even those solutions can be defeated by a determined individual. It's no different here. We definitely need to define the threats before we can figure out how to defeat those, whether that is mostly in the private sector or mostly in the public sector. I suspect it's some mix of that. And when it gets right down to it, we need some clear definition of critical infrastructure. That tends to be the key word in whether government's going to be involved or not in our financial networks, critical infrastructure. At the end of the day, we need to think about the power we're going to grant to the federal government in these areas. I believe a strong partnership of the government with the private sector should be the goal, rather than a bunch of new regulations, new bureaucracy. We could imagine the Department of Cybersecurity Protection that had some overreaching authority that would, again, stop innovation and stop private industry industry and likely be bound up in bureaucracy, and like a lot of our security functions, be misdirected, not actually serve the people that it's supposed to serve.
Bartlett, with social media becoming such an important part of our daily lives, privacy is a big issue. Many have been critical of the data sharing policies of big California companies like Facebook and Google. What's your view on this? Are the current privacy policies of these companies sufficient, or should government do more to protect our privacy in this social media-driven world?
So I'm going to leave the listeners with a tease on this one, if you guys will allow me to do that. The next piece that will be coming out is on net neutrality and how that it's actually good for what we call edge providers, or for the technology industry, the industry that is largely located in California. And then the piece after that is exactly on privacy and what California has been considering, what's been rejected so far, but what they're still discussing to do. So I'd encourage listeners to check in soon to the website, and hopefully they will see those pieces up there.
Well, finally, Bartlett, we always like to end on a light note, and that usually involves wine. We're big fans of California wine, given our proximity to wine country. So with that spirit, please share with our listeners your recommendation for either your favorite wine or other adult beverage that our listeners should try.
This one was so easy. I'm glad you asked me. Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Artemis or Fay, I was reminded over the weekend. Both delicious, both fruitier. If you like that, I know if you're really kind of hip and cool, you like the drier wines. These are not that. Much fruitier, much fuller flavor, but less mineral. And for folks who know Napa Valley wines, I know they have the volcanic ash, so that good mineral flavor, but I prefer the fruitier one. So again, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, either Artemis or Fay.
Thanks, Bartlett. Thanks again to Bartlett Cleland and to my colleague Tim Anaya. To read Bartlett's work, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. And while you're there, check out our new blog, Right by the Bay. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/pacificresearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode with PRI.